The world told people where they belonged. Kings above peasants, celestial dragons above humanity, fishmen beneath the sea, slaves beneath everyone. And somewhere inside the machine, he will stop questioning the chains. Because that's what systems do over time. They make cruelty feel normal, they make oppression feel inherited, they make freedom feel impossible. But then, a boy in a straw hat sailed into the world laughing. Not because he didn't understand suffering, but because the world's rules never made sense to him in the first place. He ate a forbidden fruit before he understood consequence, declared war on gods before he understood fear, and kept charging toward the horizon, like freedom itself was something human beings were supposed to have. People called him reckless, stupid, dangerous, and maybe he was, because every kingdom he entered changed after he left. Prisons opened, tyrants fell, cowards found courage, and people who spent their entire lives ashamed of themselves slowly remembered how to breathe again. He never cared about status, or bloodlines, or race, or the invisible walls people used to divide each other. To Luffy, a person was just a person, and that simple belief became catastrophic to a world around him, because systems built on hierarchy cannot survive around people who instinctively treat others as equals. That's why emperors feared him, why tyrants hated him, why broken people followed him. Not because he wanted to rule them, but because he made them feel free enough to become themselves. And somewhere between the laughter, the loss, Marineford, the chains he shattered, and the drums that echoed beneath despair, the reckless boy became something larger than a pirate. Not a conqueror, not a king, but a son. A force that reminded people the sky was never meant to belong to tyrants. And that's why he is not the saint of rebellion. He's the saint of liberation, the saint of freedom that makes room for others. This is the book of Luffy, and the myth that freedom belongs only to the powerful ends here. A warrior from the sea came to land. He found a boy who thought himself a man. So the warrior gave him a chance. "You want freedom," he said. "Earn it." And so the boy had eaten a fallen fruit and gained an eternal scar before learning the sin of consequence. After the sin was made, he kept dreaming of an endless ocean, of food, joy, and freedom from fate. Soon, other children followed, and together they grew in the land of gray and ash, a place you feel chained without gold, without power, without a dominion. The three boys who grow into men each found a different path. One of fire, one who seek revelation, and one of freedom. The world would try and limit them, to control them, but fate would eventually teach them what true manhood meant. Freedom always begins as childish desire, and so when Luffy committed the sin of recklessness, it wasn't an evil, it was desiring freedom before understanding the cost. When the boy finally grew into a man, he chased a dream of sea and shared kin. They'd laugh, they'd mock, yet he never abandoned his inner compass, and soon he built a domain of dreams, free enough for others to chase theirs. His companions came from across the sea, a warrior who'd only wield a blade for another's vision that felt unbreakable. The next, a girl who'd sell your soul for her people, yet saw a man to follow who wouldn't bargain. Then came the liar whose fables made gods tremble, yet only found one who saw through them. A cook who dreamt of an all blue, but whose inner world draped itself in isolation. Then a monster, feared and blamed as useless. His medicine became divine under the one man whose challenge made power flinch. The next, a girl from an island where curiosity was taught as sin. Yet her knowledge grew under the boy of the boundless compass. Her mind taught that with learning comes rebellion. And when she reached transcendence, she made even tyrants pause. Then came a man of iron and invention, a child abandoned to rust and wreckage, who rebuilt himself louder than his grief. The world called him unnatural, so he answered by becoming impossible. And beneath all the steel and spectacle was simply a boy who wanted his creation to be loved. Then came a skeleton who carried music through death itself. A man who lost everyone, yet refused to let loneliness silence his song. Even when time stripped flesh and bone, his spirit still laughed against the dark. For some souls become lighter after surviving the grave. And then came a son of the sea, born beneath the weight of hatred older than himself. A warrior taught that the world would always divide, fish from man, monster from human. Yet he followed the boy who sat beside enemies as equals, and in that freedom, even generations of bitterness began to loosen their grip. Freedom is not merely the absence of chains, it is the presence of acceptance. Most people spend their lives shrinking themselves to survive the expectations of others. They bury pieces of themselves to be loved, to belong, to avoid rejection. But Luffy did something rare. He created a space where people no longer needed permission to exist as they were. A lion could become brave, a monster could become cherished, a woman hunted for knowledge could become feared by tyrants instead of ashamed of herself. And this is why tolerance is more powerful than control. Control demands conformity, tolerance allows transformation. Luffy's freedom was never selfish, because wherever he went, people became larger versions of themselves. A man sat on a hill with nothing but a single meal. 3 strangers came to him, one poor, one angry, one who was once his enemy. Without hesitation, he split his meal 4 ways. When asked why, he said, "Because if I eat alone, I only feed my body. But if we eat together, I feed the world I want to live in." That night, the strangers didn't just eat together. They stayed, they became his crew. There will be days when you don't know where you're going. Good. That means you're free. And if your compass is kindness, if your anchor is joy, then any shore you reach is worth calling home. You don't have to rule the sea. You just have to sail it without fear. The sea was vast because the world beneath it was small. Kingdoms rotted beneath golden thrones. Children starved beneath banners of justice. And beneath the red walls of the Holy Land, men called themselves gods. They chained entire races beneath history, branded bloodlines as cursed, burned islands for knowledge too much, and called it order. But the boy with the laughing grin never understood these laws. Why should a fishman kneel? Why should a slave boy obey? Why should a man born beneath the wrong sky suffer for it? And so wherever he traveled, prisons broke, tyrants fell, and forgotten people remembered how to breathe again. For freedom terrifies those who build their kingdoms on fear. Oppression survives by convincing people that the hierarchy is natural, that suffering is deserved, that some lives matter more than others. The world government did not maintain power through strength alone. It maintained power through normalization. People accepted cruelty because they inherited it. But Luffy possesses something dangerous to systems like that. He treats dignity as instinctive. He does not calculate human worth through status, race, wealth, or history. And because of that, he disrupts oppression without even trying to. True freedom is frightening to authoritarian systems, because once people realize that chains were never sacred, they begin questioning everything. And then the sea took his brother, not through weakness, not through cowardice, but through the unbearable truth that freedom cannot protect you from loss. The boy who laughed at fear screamed until his voice broke. His hand reached forward, and still, that came back empty. For the first time since setting sail, he faced an enemy his will could not defeat. And beneath the war of fire and blood, the child inside him finally shattered. Because no dream, no freedom, no strength can spare a man from loving something he cannot keep. To love deeply is to accept vulnerability. This is the contradiction most people spend their lives avoiding. They want connection without risk, attachment without grief, love without the responsibility of loss. But freedom does not work that way. The more fully we love something, the more capable it becomes of devastating us. Ace's death was not merely tragedy, it was revelation. Luffy learned that freedom is not immunity from suffering. It is choosing to keep living openly despite it. And that lesson transformed him from a reckless boy chasing adventure into someone capable of carrying others through pain. He saw the world not as a ladder to climb, but as an ocean to sail. He didn't want a crown, he wanted a crew. His enemies became allies, not through force, but invitation. He never told you what to be, he just showed you that you could be free. They beat him to the ground again and again, until even hope itself seemed exhausted. The world waited for silence, instead the drums answered. Not the drums of war, not conquest, not domination, liberation. And suddenly, the battlefield changed shape. The man who once chased freedom became its echo, its laughter, its refusal to kneel. Even death itself cannot force despair into his spirit. For joy, true joy, is rebellion in a world built on suffering. Most systems of control rely on emotional exhaustion, fear, shame, hopelessness, because defeated people are easier to rule. That is why Luffy's laughter matters, not as comedy, but as resistance. He continues finding joy in a world obsessed with power and domination. And in doing so, he reminds others that freedom is not merely political, it is spiritual. To laugh honestly, to dream openly, to remain emotionally alive despite cruelty, it is its own form of liberation. The drums of liberation symbolizes something deeper than victory. They symbolize the refusal to let suffering decide who you become. And so the boy beneath the red sky became something the world could not contain. Not a conqueror, not a saint, not a god seated above mankind, but a son. One that rose for everyone equally, the broken, the outcast, the criminal, the forgotten, the enemy, the friend. And wherever his light reached, shackles weakens, fear loosens, and people remember the shape of their own dreams. Because freedom was never the right to stand above others, it was the courage to let others stand beside you. That is why he laughed, why he fought, why he sailed endlessly toward a horizon no cage could touch. For the freest man in the world was the one who never needed to control it. Many people misunderstand freedom as selfishness. Doing whatever you want, taking whatever you can, living without responsibility. But Luffy represents a different kind of freedom, the kind that expands outward. His presence gives others permission to exist more honestly, to dream larger, to reject shame, to stop kneeling before systems that told them they were lesser. That is why tyrants fear people like him, because domination depends on emotional submission. And the moment people rediscover their humanity, control begins to fail. Luffy teaches that freedom is not about ruling others, it is about refusing to reduce them. And that may be the most dangerous philosophy of all. They called them reckless, but empires do not fear reckless men. They fear liberating ones. The sea did not shape Luffy through friendship alone. It shaped him through monsters, through emperors, through tyrants, through men and women who mistook power for meaning. Each one circled him like a dark star around a rising sun. And every battle became theological, not merely of strength, but of philosophy. Because the Yonko were never just rulers of territory. They were rulers of belief. 5 living answers to the question, what does a human build when given enough power to stop fearing consequence? And each of them revealed something terrifying about freedom. Whitebeard loved so deeply that the world itself could not buy him. Big Mouth consumed so endlessly that even her family became prisoners inside her hunger. Kaido sought meaning through destruction because he no longer believed life could offer it naturally. Shanks carried power gently, like a father carrying a blade near sleeping children. And Buggy became proof that myth itself does not care about truth. Only momentum, only belief. The sea crowned a coward because the world is often too exhausted to distinguish between performance and purpose. And somewhere in the middle of these living ideologies stood a boy laughing at the horizon. Luffy never ruled like them. That is precisely why he surpassed them. Because while the Yonko built kingdoms around themselves, Luffy built freedom around others. That is the difference between a ruler and a liberator. But the sea did not test him with emperors alone. No. Before Luffy could challenge the gods of legacy, he first had to descend through the warlords, the false saints, the fractured kings, the men who turned their wounds into systems. Crocodile taught him the arrogance of controlled despair. A man so disillusioned by failure that he buried nations beneath manipulation rather than risk believing again. He no longer sought freedom, only leverage. Doflamingo was worse, because Doflamingo understood the world completely. Its cruelty, its hypocrisy, its hidden violence. And instead of rejecting that corruption, he worshipped it. He saw the world as inherently monstrous, so he decided morality itself was childish. That is what makes him terrifying, not evil, lucid. A man who mistook understanding darkness for transcending it. Mura consumed grief until he replaced human connection with corpses. Humans sacrificed humanity so others could keep theirs. Mihawk isolated himself at the peak of strength until solitude became identity. Boa turned trauma into divinity because vulnerability once enslaved her. Each warlord became a distorted answer to suffering. A philosophy born from pain, left untreated. And that is why Luffy terrifies them. Because he does not meet suffering by becoming smaller, or harder, or crueler, he remains open. That is his impossible trait. The world keeps offering reasons to become like them, and he refuses every time. That refusal is the true source of his freedom. Not the fruit, not the power, not destiny, but his ability to suffer without surrendering his humanity to it. That is why tyrants cannot understand him, why conquerors fail to protect him, why broken people follow him. He does not stand above others like a king demanding worship. He walks beside them, and somehow reminds them they were never born for chains. And perhaps that is the final confession of Saint Vice. The world keeps teaching people that freedom meant domination, but the sea revealed a far stranger truth. The freest man alive was the one who never needed to reduce others to feel whole. This sense of affirmation. Freedom is not domination. It is the courage to let others exist fully beside me. When fear tells me to control, to judge, to shrink others so I can feel safe, I will remember, chains are not always made of iron. Sometimes they are made of pride, or prejudice, of the need to stand above someone else. St. Luffy whispered me, laugh loudly, live openly, and never become the kind of person who needs others smaller to feel whole. This saint's ritual, the open horizon. When you feel trapped by fear, shame, social pressure, or the expectations of others, go outside if possible. Lift your head toward the sky. Take one full breath deeply into your chest and ask, what part of myself have I been shrinking to survive? Then loosen your shoulder physically. Unclench your jaw, open your hands, and take one small action that feels honest instead of performative. Message the person, speak the truth, wear what feels like you, laugh without apologizing for it, and speak this final phrase, I was not made for chains. Meaning, freedom begins the moment you stop asking permission to exist honestly. This saint symbolizes radical freedom, non-judgment, and compassion through understanding. The Nobel Sin lesson is, the freest man isn't the one with power, it's the one with nothing to prove. Luffy stands in the Gospel of Nobel Sin as a holy wanderer, a living wind. He reminds us that liberation includes the freedom of others too, that true freedom is shared, and power that frees only yourself is still a cage. He is the untethered heart. In Noble Sin, Luffy's saintliness doesn't come from doing whatever you want. That's the surface level. His true doctrine is, freedom means allowing others to exist fully without forcing them into your fear, hierarchy, or prejudice. Luffy is dangerous because he rejects domination instinctively. He treats identity as irrelevant. He liberates people simply by allowing them to be seen. He's not merely free, he creates freedom around him. That's why kingdoms change after he leaves. Society survives by teaching fear. Luffy refuses that instinctively. Owen Park, Alabasta, Enies Lobby, Sabaody. This is where freedom becomes political. Luffy realized the world is engineered around domination. Celestial dragons especially matter here. Freedom cannot coexist without dehumanization. Ace dies, Luffy fails, his strength proves insufficient. This is when he realized freedom does not exempt you from grief. This is where childish freedom dies. Gear 5, Joy Boy, the dreams of liberation. But the important thing, Luffy becomes liberation not through conquest, but through refusal to spiritually submit. He was the boundless compass who taught that true freedom survives even in chains. His liberation incarnate, tolerance embodied, and joyous rebellion. The final revelation, the freest person is the one who does not need to control others. That's the saintly truth. Freedom is a sacred responsibility. He symbolizes freedom as resistance against systems of domination and the gospel of radical acceptance. His crew embodies rejection, shame, isolation, and self-distortion. And Luffy's presence disrupts those emotional prisons. He doesn't fix them, he creates enough freedom for them to rediscover themselves. His philosophy ends on liberation, not control. And his creed, understand before you fight, and if you must fight, do it without hate. But freedom alone cannot heal a wounded soul. Because what happens when the chains are no longer around your body, but inside your heart? Luffy taught us liberation, how to laugh at fear, how to reject the systems that try to decide what deserves to exist. But there are some prisons no tyrant creates: hatred, violence, the grief you mistake for purpose. The next video follows a warrior who learned too late that revenge does not bring peace. Thorfinn. If Luffy is the saint of freedom that liberates others, then Thorfinn is the saint of peace, forged only after surviving hatred. He is the man who only became a saint after he learned to put the sword down. Saints are mirrors, myths are tools. I walk the crownless path. The full scripture of Saint Luffy is recorded in the Crownless Testament. Follow Project Nobel Sin, your myth for meaning. Somewhere beyond the veil of Kairos, beyond the books, beyond the hands that wrote them, something stirred. Not flesh, not spirit, recognition. A sea of dark glass stretched endlessly beneath the fractured sky, and upon its surface, 3 figures stood waiting. One smiled while balancing a ball against his heel. One sat upon a throne of ash with folded arms, and one stared into the reflection beneath his feet as though searching for the person he almost became. Saint Bachira, Saint Bakugo, and Saint Oikawa, the saints of selfhood, the first testament, the first fragments gathered within the crownless cycle. The whisper and the noise spoke first. Something is changing. The ashen crown lifted his gaze. Yeah, feels like the world's holding its breath. Then the mirror of potential looked beyond the horizon, towards something approaching through the lattice beyond thought itself. A pulse, like drums beneath water, like chains snapping somewhere impossibly far away. And for the first time in a very long while, the saints felt movement inside the weave. Not invocation, not prayer, assembly. Then a voice echoed from beyond the veil, ancient, fractured, laughing softly beneath its grief. The crownless cycle has begun. The sea trembled, and somewhere in the distance, a boy in a straw hat laughed against the dark.